I've been a trucker for almost 15 years, and this particular event took place back in 2017. I was doing an overnight haul through the vast, empty stretch of the Mojave Desert in California, headed toward Arizona. If I remember correctly, I was hauling appliances, but the details of the load are a bit hazy after all this time. What I do remember vividly is the drive itself, the complete darkness that seemed to swallow everything around me. The only light cutting through the void came from my semi's headlights, which were dim as hell. I'd been putting off getting them fixed. Typical, I know, but I never thought it would be a big issue. Normally the dim lights weren't too noticeable on well-lit roads, but out there in the desert where no one else was driving, it was like I was trying to see through a thick black curtain. Every few minutes I found myself squinting and leaning forward, struggling to make out the barely visible strip of asphalt ahead of me. Honestly, it was the kind of setting that could have been a horror story all on its own. The road was dead straight for miles, with no signs of life, no other vehicles, nothing but desert for as far as you could imagine. I debated pulling over and waiting for the sunrise, letting my eyes rest and giving myself a break from the growing tension. But time was money, and I needed it badly, so I convinced myself to keep pushing forward, even though part of me knew it wasn't the wisest decision. I told myself, "You've driven these roads 1,000 times. You'll be fine." It was about an hour before sunrise when things started getting weird. Out of nowhere, I noticed something up ahead, just barely visible in the dim light. At first, it looked like a shadow or a mirage, the kind of thing you think you see after staring into the darkness for too long. But then it became clearer, and I realized it was a car, parked right in the middle of the road, dead center on the double yellow lines. I immediately panicked, thinking it could be an animal or some stranded motorist I might hit. I slammed on the brakes hard, my truck screeching as it came to a stop just a foot from smashing into the car's rear bumper. The sound of my tires skidding against the pavement echoed through the desert, adding to the eerie silence. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The car's hazard lights were on, blinking steadily, but the passenger door was wide open. The combination of those two things immediately set off alarm bells in my head. I've always considered myself pretty fearless. Years of trucking and a few bar fights will do that to you. But something about this whole situation felt off. Really off. My gut told me to just drive away, but I also couldn't shake the thought that someone might be in trouble, maybe stuck out here needing help. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I reversed my semi a few feet and pulled over to the side of the road, cutting the engine. I thought about tossing down some flares, but quickly dismissed the idea. There hadn't been another vehicle for miles, so I figured I wouldn't need them. I grabbed my flashlight from the cab and stepped out into the desert night. It was warm, but there was this eerie stillness. No wind, no sounds, just the faint clicking of the car's hazard lights breaking the silence. I started walking toward the vehicle, my footsteps sounding way too loud in the quietness of the night. As I got closer, I could make out the car's details. It was a red Ford Fusion, probably a newer model. The paint was dusty, like it had been there for a while, but the fact that the hazard lights were still flashing told me it hadn't been abandoned too long. I walked around the side of the car, keeping a cautious distance from the open passenger door. As I peered inside, I was met with an unexpected sight. Nothing. The car was completely empty. No driver, no passengers, no personal belongings strewn about. Just an empty, still car sitting in the middle of the desert. That's when the unease really hit me. I wasn't just dealing with a stranded car anymore. There was something unsettling about it being empty, especially with the door left open like that. I felt an involuntary shiver run down my spine, and I found myself glancing around into the darkness, half expecting someone, or something, to appear out of nowhere. The headlights of my truck were the only source of light, and beyond that, it was pitch black. My heart started to pound a little harder, and I could feel my instincts telling me to get out of there. But curiosity has a way of overriding common sense sometimes, and I figured I might as well check things out a little further. I leaned inside the car, giving the interior a closer look. Everything seemed normal. The keys were still in the ignition, but the engine was off. No signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing out of the ordinary except for the fact that it was just sitting there with no one in sight. My mind started racing, coming up with all kinds of possible scenarios. Maybe someone had gone for help. Maybe they'd wandered off and gotten lost. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't just leave without getting to the bottom of it. I decided to check the trunk. I don't know why, maybe I'd seen too many crime shows, but it felt like the next logical step. The trunk was locked, so I grabbed the keys from the ignition and unlocked it. But even with the key, the trunk wouldn't budge. It felt like something was jammed inside. Frustrated, I opened the back seat and tried accessing the trunk from there. To my surprise, the back seats folded down easily, revealing 3 large, tightly packed garbage bags stuffed into the trunk. My stomach dropped. I glanced over my shoulder again, suddenly feeling very exposed out there in the open desert. Against my better judgment, I reached in and grabbed one of the bags just to see what was inside. That's when it happened. A gunshot, loud and sharp, cutting through the stillness. The sound was so close it felt like it was right next to my head. Startled, I banged my head hard against the roof of the car and stumbled backward, heart racing out of control. I didn't think. I just reacted. I threw the keys onto the front seat and bolted, running full speed back to my truck. As I scrambled into the driver's seat, I heard a voice, a deep, gruff voice yelling, "Hey!" over and over again, getting closer with every second. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, trying to start the truck. The engine stalled briefly and I cursed under my breath. That's when I saw him, a short, stocky guy with fiery red hair, dressed in overalls and wearing shin-high boots. In one hand, he held a small shovel, and in the other, an old hunting rifle. He was standing right there about 20 feet away, his eyes locked onto mine. There was this look of desperation, like he was trying to decide what to do next. He didn't move at first, just stood there, staring at me, holding that shovel like it was a lifeline. And then, as I put the truck into gear and started to pull away, he dropped the shovel and began frantically waving his hands, yelling, "Wait, wait!" But there was no way in hell I was stopping. I hit the gas hard, the truck lurching forward as I sped past him. In the rearview mirror, I could see him sprinting after me for a few seconds before turning around and running back to his car. I thought I was in the clear. I figured I'd left him behind and that was the end of it. But about 5 minutes later, I saw headlights coming up fast behind me. Panic gripped me tighter than ever before. I called 911, my hands trembling as I explained the situation, trying to make sense of what was happening while the car behind me honked furiously, staying right on my tail. I had no clue what this guy's intentions were, but I wasn't about to stop and find out. After what felt like an eternity, the car pulled ahead of me and cut me off, forcing me to slow down. Just when I thought he was going to ram into me or worse, police lights flashed in the distance. The Ford swerved off the road and sped into the desert, disappearing into the darkness. When the officer finally arrived, I told him everything. But instead of going after the guy, he just took my statement. I was furious. I begged him to chase the car, but he assured me backup would handle it. They never called me with an update. None of my trucking buddies have a story quite like this, and I've told it countless times over the years. Some people think that guy was up to something far worse than I'd care to imagine. A lot of my friends joke that he was burying bodies out there, but the size of that shovel has always made me doubt that theory. Still, I'll never forget that night. Since then, I've never felt quite the same driving through deserts alone at night. Something about it just stays with you. I'm sure you've probably come across those modern videos online where truckers document their daily lives and give tips to each other. Or maybe you haven't, but it's become quite a trend now. Since I'm a bit younger compared to many in this industry, every time I open TikTok or YouTube Shorts, that's practically all I see. I won't dive too deep into it, but I had to drop out of a pretty prestigious university for some personal reasons. People often tell me that I could have done more with my life, that I could have been more than just a trucker. But honestly, it's not such a bad gig. I've been doing this for over 2 years now, making deliveries all over the place. Of course, the most challenging part of the job isn't really the driving. It's the long hours and the isolation. It's hard to predict how that kind of loneliness will affect you until you've actually experienced it firsthand. My advice to anyone considering this line of work would be to make peace with any personal struggles or demons you might have inside. Because trust me, when you're out on the road alone for hours on end, they will definitely come out and start playing tricks with your mind. That's what happened to me anyway. About 3 months into my first job as a trucker, something strange happened that I'll never forget. At the time, I was driving from southern New Jersey to Lafayette, Indiana, which is about a 12-hour drive. 12 hours might not sound like too much if you're thinking about it casually, but it feels like a lot when you've just wrapped up an 8-hour drive right before it. I was still pretty new to the whole trucking thing back then, and I was trying to get my deliveries done as quickly as possible. So I decided to push through the night to make it to Lafayette by around 3 a.m. Everything was going smoothly at first. The roads were mostly empty and I was able to drive a bit faster than usual without worrying too much about other cars. About halfway through the trip though, I reached for a Red Bull to keep myself awake and realized I was out. I had completely forgotten to restock after my last delivery. Frustrated, I slapped my dashboard a few times, knowing that I'd have to stop somewhere for a drink. There's nothing I hate more than making stops in the middle of a long drive. I don't know if this is just me, but I always feel way more tired when my vehicle isn't moving, even if I'm only stopped for a short while. I glanced at my GPS and figured I had no choice. Either stop and get something to keep me awake or risk falling asleep at the wheel. In my tired mind, those two options felt like they were equally bad. Reluctantly, I pulled off at the first service stop I saw. I had no clue where I was, probably somewhere in Ohio by that point. But when I got closer, I realized this wasn't actually a proper service stop. It looked more like an abandoned gas station that someone had repurposed into a tiny convenience store. It was run down and gave off a weird vibe, but I figured there was another store up the road, and if this one didn't work out, I'd just try the next. So, I parked the semi and decided to give this odd little place a shot first. As I walked over, I didn't expect much. Honestly, I figured one of two things would happen. Either the store would be open, or the door would be locked, and I'd have to move on. You can imagine my surprise when the door swung open into a completely pitch-black room. The place was deserted. No lights, no people, nothing. But something inside me pushed me to at least take a look around, so I stepped inside, hoping there might still be a drink or a snack left behind somewhere. Just as I was about to give up and turn around, my eyes adjusted to the darkness and I noticed a faint glow coming from the back of the store. It was subtle, but definitely there. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly made my way over to it. The glow was coming from what looked like a back room, so I opened the door carefully. To my surprise, there was a refrigerator plugged in against the wall, glowing softly in the darkness. I felt a weird sense of relief, like maybe this trip wasn't going to be a total waste after all. But when I opened the fridge, I found nothing. The entire thing had been gutted, no shelves, no drinks, nothing. It was just an empty shell. As I closed the fridge door, I thought I heard a faint clattering sound coming from the main room. It sounded like something hitting the floor, and it made me freeze in my tracks. For a few seconds, I stood there listening. Had I imagined it? Maybe it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I quietly walked back into the main room and glanced around, but there was nothing out of place. Part of me wanted to investigate further, but honestly, I was exhausted and just didn't have the energy for it. I left the store and practically jogged over to the other shop up the road. Thankfully, this one was open, and I quickly bought an energy drink and headed back to my truck. But something still felt off about that abandoned store. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. As I climbed back into my truck, I took one last look at the store and noticed something strange. The door was open again. I was 100% certain I had closed it behind me when I left. But at that point, I didn't care enough to stick around and figure it out. I started the engine and merged back onto the highway as quickly as I could. The caffeine kicked in pretty fast, snapping me out of my sleepy haze. As I drove, my mind wandered back to what had just happened, and the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. I mean, sure, maybe there was a squatter living in that abandoned store, but I couldn't stop thinking about that refrigerator. What was the point of keeping an empty fridge plugged in like that? Just as I was trying to brush off the weirdness, I noticed something odd. The curtain behind my seat, the one separating the driver's cabin from the sleeper section, started moving. I broke out in a cold sweat as I watched it billow and shift, even though the air conditioning wasn't on. My heart raced, and I instantly thought the worst. There was someone in my truck. I didn't have any weapons or anything to defend myself, so I discreetly pulled out my phone and punched in the nearest police station. Those next 20 minutes were the most terrifying of my life. Every second I imagined someone creeping up from behind me, trying to grab me or take control of the truck. When I finally pulled into the police station, I stopped the semi as close to the entrance as I could and ran for help. Within minutes, the police had surrounded my truck and they made me open the back. What they found will haunt me forever. They pulled out 3 homeless-looking people, 2 men and 1 woman. They were filthy, wrapped in dirty blankets, and one of the men was holding 2 switchblades. None of them said a word. They just stared at me with cold, menacing eyes as they were cuffed and taken away. I have no idea what their plan was, or how long they had been hiding in my truck. To this day, I don't think I'll ever really know. My name is Kevin, and I've been working as a trucker for various companies for nearly 15 years now. Over the years, this job has become pretty routine for me. The process is almost always the same. Pick up goods and materials, verify them to make sure everything is accurate, and deliver them to where they need to go. In this line of work, we're not paid by the hour, so getting things done quickly and efficiently is the most important part of the job. After all this time on the road, I like to think I've got the upper hand compared to some of these younger truckers who are just starting out and picking up these jobs. But while experience can be a good thing, it can also be dangerous. You see, I tend to push myself to the absolute limit when it comes to working with little or no sleep. About 4 years ago, I had a job for a warehouse based in North Dakota. For anyone who isn't familiar, North Dakota is one of the flattest states in the U.S., which can make trucking a little easier because you're not dealing with a lot of mountains or steep roads. This also meant that skipping out on a few hours of sleep didn't feel like that big of a deal. It was often the difference between getting the job done and keeping my job or getting fired. I remember this one specific day. It was a cold Tuesday morning in May. The start of the week always meant more shipments, which also meant more work for me. I was determined to get everything done in one trip, so I mapped out my route into Montana, planning to drive straight through without stopping for sleep. I hit the road a few hours after lunch, expecting to arrive at my destination early the next morning. As I drove, I pushed my truck to go as fast as I could, maybe a little over the speed limit. By the time it got late, I found myself fighting to stay awake. I remember rubbing the sleep out of my eyes as midnight passed. I was struggling to keep my eyes open, but I only had about an hour left of the drive, so I gritted my teeth and pressed on. My buddy Tristan, who's also a trucker, had introduced me to something called smelling salts when I first started this job. If you're not familiar, smelling salts are these little bottles with crystals inside that give off a strong smell. One sniff, and you're wide awake. Tristan had warned me, though, that you had to be careful because using them too often could be dangerous. But whenever I was desperate, like I was that night, I reached for them. I took a big whiff of the smelling salts and felt the burn in my nose, but immediately, I felt more awake. The adrenaline kicked in, and I hoped it would be enough to keep me going for the rest of the drive. About 30 minutes later, though, I was really struggling again. I started to doze off and my truck drifted onto the shoulder, the rumble of the road jerking me awake. At that point, I realized this was getting dangerous. I needed to pull over, but I was alone on the highway, and there wasn't anywhere to stop, just thick woods on either side of the road. I slowed the truck down, hoping to find a spot to pull off safely. As I drove slower, my headlights cut through the darkness, letting me see more of what was ahead. That's when I saw something that made me do a double take. A purple dress lying in the middle of the road. I blinked hard, wondering if I was seeing things. Was I hallucinating from the lack of sleep? I rubbed my eyes again and again, but it was real. I stared at the dress as I drove past, confused. Looking back, I should have taken that as a red flag, but at the time, I was too exhausted to really process what was happening. A few hundred yards later, I saw something else. A pair of shoes just lying there on the side of the road. Now I was starting to feel uneasy. What in the world was going on? I passed the shoes, hoping to God that I'd find a place to pull over soon. My father, David, was a deeply religious man, and in moments like this, I would reach for the old cross he'd left me when he passed. I clutched it tightly, silently praying that I'd be safe. As I kept driving, I started seeing more clothing scattered along the road, including what looked like kids' clothing. That's when I decided to stop. My heart was pounding, and I had this awful feeling that something was very wrong. I sat there for a moment, frozen in my seat, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I gave in to my instincts and got out of the truck to take a closer look. The cold air hit me immediately, waking me up a little more. I walked cautiously toward the pile of clothing, feeling the weight of the situation in my gut. The clothes were definitely children's clothing, both boys' and girls' clothes. I felt a chill run down my spine as I glanced into the woods. It was pitch black and I couldn't see anything, but I had the nagging feeling that someone or something was watching me. I decided it wasn't my place to figure out what was going on, so I turned back toward my truck. Just as I did, I heard a crunching sound from the trees to my left. I spun around, my heart racing, trying to figure out where the sound had come from. After a few seconds of silence, I heard another crunch, this time from the other side of the road. That's when my survival instincts kicked in. I sprinted back to my truck, jumped into the cab, and slammed the door shut. But before I could even catch my breath, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A child's scream, coming from the woods. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to help, but the other part of me knew that rushing into those dark woods was a terrible idea. Before I could make a decision, I heard another scream. It sounded almost identical to the first one. Without thinking, I turned the truck on and pointed the headlights toward the woods. About 30 yards in, I saw them. 3 or 4 people, one of them holding a massive speaker. As soon as my headlights hit them, they ducked behind the trees, but I had seen enough. They were trying to lure me into the woods with a fake child's scream. I was in shock. I just sat there for a moment, staring at the spot where they had disappeared, trying to process what was happening. I reached for my phone to call the police, but before I could dial, I heard a loud thump against the side of my truck. Someone had thrown something at it. That was it for me. I slammed on the gas and sped off, not looking back. As I drove away, I saw a figure on the other side of the road. He shouted something I couldn't make out and threw something at my truck, cracking the passenger side window. The rest of the drive passed in silence. I was too shaken to process what had just happened, but there was no way I was stopping until I got far, far away from those woods. I finished my delivery and passed out, sleeping for nearly 10 hours straight. When I finally woke up, the first thing I did was call the police. They said they'd look into it, but I never heard back. To this day, I still don't know what those people were trying to do. Why didn't they rush me when they had the chance? What would have happened if I had fallen for their trick and gone into the woods? In all my years of trucking, nothing has ever come close to being as strange or terrifying as that night.